kind of like kids, right? Kids have to be exposed to new foods like hundreds of times before they could really say if they like it or not. And
Yeah.
building of those taste buds and changing those taste buds. Our taste buds evolve and change over our lifetime, and we can change those taste buds. So if I'm used to a highly processed diet, it'll take some time to adjust those taste buds, but slowly as we incorporate natural sugars into our diets more, that shift will happen.
All right, welcome back to another episode of the Wellness Dojo Podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Craig, and today I'm excited to bring in our special guest. She's a registered dietitian who is passionate about helping people with something called culinary medicine, which is really intriguing to me. So please welcome to the show, Theresa Dvorak.
Hi, thanks, Kyle. It's great to be here. Yes, my name's Theresa Dvorak. I've been a registered dietitian for over 15 years now, a while. And yeah, I kind of came to nutrition kind of happenstance a little bit. I was in this growing up space where, my parents were avid gardeners and procurers, and did a lot of cooking from scratch and baking and all of these kinds of things, which I guess kind of stems back from, multiple generations, because my mom came from a long line of farmers, and my dad came from a line of butchers. And so it was very much kind of hands-on with the origins of food. And, also just trying to make things delicious. And so the kitchen was always very much the center of our house, as it is for a lot of people, but not everybody. And so I certainly, as I got older, realized that, that was something somewhat unique, maybe different from my friends growing up or what have you. As everyone loved coming over to our house because mom always had a homemade meal. And so we always had this love of cooking and food and togetherness and that community and that sense of family. And everybody was welcome at that table. And so that was just a great space to be in, right? It was always a very safe space, and welcoming, right? And then I was an athlete growing up, and so I was always eating everything that I could get my fingers on, kind of a thing. But then it wasn't until I was in undergraduate school where I was studying to become an athletic trainer, so within sports medicine, and really realizing that a lot of my colleagues didn't have a very extensive understanding of nutrition as well as performance nutrition for athletes. And so I was often, so I was compelled to get more information and to learn more, and to be some of that resource for my colleagues as well as the athletes that I was working with. And then that transformed into getting a master's degree in nutrition from the University of Utah, where I now work. And within that, it was a sports nutrition emphasis. So I became a certified specialist in sports dietetics. And within that, that's where kind of the cooking started to come in, because it was certainly, we had athletes as well as just active community members that were wanting to fuel their bodies better, not only for performance, but wellness as well. And so that was kind of the start of my transition into a little bit more preventative health wellness space, kind of parallel to that athletic performance. And so we started doing cooking classes for athletes and community members around different topics related to performance or health or disease management or what have you. And that's really where kind of that my loves kind of came together, right? I really enjoyed teaching people how to cook and empowering them to fuel their bodies and take kind of harness that power to achieve wellness in many different ways. And building confidence and competence in the kitchen is really key to being able to, prepare your own healthy meals. And regardless of that, it brings community together. I think people slowly start to find that joy and that sense of ownership and really wanting to take pride in, providing not only themselves with a delicious, healthy meal, which I do believe can be on the same plate, and as well sharing that with their friends and family, and building that community around the table.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting because I think there's a dynamic when it comes to nutrition, and I think you just kind of touched on that dynamic is, you know, starting with the early days of your experience with the kitchen being the center of the home and that gathering of family and community together. It's like really at the core of what food is. Like that's what it's all about, is like this gathering, this sharing together. That's always kind of been through like almost all cultures, I think, of just like what it is. It's about like we gather together, we share this meal, we kind of embrace this meal. But then you get to this other side of nutrition as well, where it's like very science-based, it's very performance-based, it's very what do I need to optimize what I want from food. And these are two like really competing worlds of nutrition. So it's really cool to hear that you've kind of taken your experience with both of those things and kind of brought them together to try and create something that kind of brings those worlds together and finds almost, it sounds like a middle ground, if that's, is that accurate?
Yeah, I think it's having this combination of the two, right? Because there's certainly, different disease states or performance nutrition or things of that sort that maybe require some really kind of fine-tuned levels of
Mm.
macro or micronutrients, right? Like really drilled down to those basic molecules. But then, right, like that's not how we eat.
Yeah,
And so I think that's always, I think that's really where the role of a registered dietitian too comes into play, is that translational piece
mm,
of translating that, you talk to a scientist and that research, they want to be able to drill it down, they want to be able to control as many possible variables that they can. But in reality, that's not how we eat, right?
yeah,
We don't get all of our vitamin C from a pill, right? Like that's it's in combination of different things. Same thing with, any of our carbohydrates, our fats, our proteins. What are we eating all together?
mm,
And then, what are these other pieces that the literature is really starting to identify the other spaces that influence how our body uses those foods, but also those individual nutrients.
mm,
So thinking about, how much physical activity are we doing? Are we physically active, right? Our stress, our mental health, even just slowing down and taking kind of a pause really does affect our digestion, and how our bodies are utilizing these nutrients that we're consuming. What did we eat the rest of the day, or have we eaten before versus now? Are we in a stressed environment, whether that's our physical environment or within our body's environment? So there's so many pieces that go into play, and that's really, I think, that's kind of the art and science of a dietitian, right? Is
Yeah.
being able to kind of bring it together, because nutrition in and of itself is a science and an art.
Yeah.
And so that's where that culture piece comes in, and that building of community, which is really so strong in our overall wellness.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a really fascinating thing. And I think that's what makes like nutrition holistic, right? Is like all these different pieces that go into it, whether you're eating for a goal or whether you're just like trying to, have a good relationship with food or whatever the case might be. There's all these other aspects that come into it versus just like how many calories am I eating? What are my macronutrient targets? Like these types of things. There's a lot that influence not just your ability to do that, but how effective that process is, right?
Yep.
Like, yeah, like
Yeah,
what
exactly.
people who are trying to lose weight, for example, they can be hitting like all the right calories, all the right macronutrients and stuff, but like if they're not taking into account, like you mentioned, their stress levels, their relationships, and like what happens during the day that day, it could be very easy for somebody to just say to themselves that they're just not good enough to follow this or whatever the case might be. But it's like all these factors affect your nutrition. And like you said, your diet, like how your body actually takes those nutrients and what it does with it too. So
Yeah.
it's really cool.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're trying to do within this space of culinary medicine, and utilizing the kitchen as a teaching laboratory, right? So
Mm,
this other term called a teaching kitchens, and using it, we use it here at the University of Utah for many purposes. We have a phenomenal kind of cooking laboratory, with multiple cook stations, kind of mini kitchens all placed together. And specifically our culinary medicine class is bringing together graduate students from across our health sciences. So we have students that are in medical school, that are, in nursing school, pharmacy, nutrition, occupational therapy, social work, kind of across anybody that could be working in a healthcare space, right? And coming together in a kitchen, and we're building counseling skills. We're building these skills of how do I talk, kind of that art piece, right, to
yeah.
nutrition, because a lot of them have that solid scientific base, and that's kind of where they're comfortable, right? They know that biochemistry, and they can tell you, up and down what's happening on a physiological level. But the reality is that's almost impossible for most of our patients to understand and
Yeah.
then put into practice. So us as healthcare clinicians need to be able to translate some of that, right? And then for those others who are not dietitians, know when to refer to a dietitian. And when that conversation needs to be longer, more in depth, multifaceted. But, bringing folks into a kitchen, we know that they are building their own confidence and competence with cooking. And what we know about behavioral practices, especially among clinicians, is that when they engage in a behavior, they are more likely to speak about it to their patients during their counseling. So if they are more physically active, they're more likely to talk about physical activity with their patients. If they prepare food at home, they're more likely to ask about their nutrition and what are their home eating habits. If they, are thinking about mindfulness or meditation or things like that, they're more likely to talk about those pieces with their patients.
Yeah.
And so that's really powerful, because it's not only, enhancing the self-care and the wellness of our healthcare professionals, which, over the last several years has been extremely strained. And the more that we can elevate and support those clinicians, the better our overall care of our patients and the rest of the community certainly as well. But then they're talking about those and having those conversations with their patients within their communities. And it just brings so much power to that positive change and thinking about those healthy behaviors that can not only treat disease, but prevent disease. And that's really where that golden ticket is if we can prevent disease, that's the big thing, right? That's what we want to be shooting for.
Yeah, that's like the number one thing that we hear when we're talking to people about like, what are your goals? Why do you want to achieve this goal? It's like it almost always comes down to avoiding disease, and like it's just the thing that we're the most afraid of, I think, in the world, right?
Certainly.
It's you mentioned something before. I want to go back to, you mentioned like so much of our vitamins and minerals and all these types of things are like in I'm gonna say medicine form. Like they're in pill form. Like you get vitamin C from a pill, you get vitamin D from a pill, you get like all these different things that are available to us where we can just like take it and we know we got it. Can you speak a little bit about like what culinary medicine really means? Like eating for medicine. Like what does that really mean?
Yeah, it's thinking about almost food as medicine. And that, when we think about supplements, for example, right? Micronutrient supplements, so our vitamin and mineral supplements, in general are pretty safe, right? Where we start to get into our risky supplements are ones that are weight loss specific or performance enhancing. And that's where we start to see a lot of contamination within those supplements and potentially harmful side effects. But within our micronutrients, so our vitamins and minerals, that's really where, if somebody is deficient in vitamin D, right? So we think about our kind of northern latitudes, right? So I'm here in the United States, so everybody kind of north of kind of Utah, Colorado, kind of right in that middle space of the United States north, for very much of the kind of the winter months, kind of that October to about April, we're not getting sufficient vitamin or UVB rays to produce that vitamin D naturally. So supplementation can be really beneficial for a lot of people. Now, bear in mind, in the summertime, if we're outside a lot, we probably don't need to take that vitamin D as regularly for most individuals, right? But then, and so that's where those vitamin minerals supplements can, be extremely impactful to improving our overall health. Certainly my philosophy, and I think most folks that are in this space of kind of holistic wellness, whole body health, food as medicine, is really thinking about food first, because there are so many kind of nuances to nutrition that we still don't understand. Honestly, nutrition is still a really young field, right?
Yeah.
Vitamin A was identified in the early 1900s, which when we think about general like health and science of the body, that's
Crazy.
really young. And so that's, there's a lot of these pieces like complementaries, right? And what helps us to digest something versus less, then and micro kind of phytonutrients, so even smaller than those micronutrients are vitamins, minerals that we don't honestly know a whole lot about of what quantities do we need to have these in. But what we do know is that a lot of foods contain those phytonutrients, right? So we think about the color of our foods. And that's really where our color is coming from, are those phytonutrients.
Yeah.
So yeah, having this complexity, having this variety, kind of eating the rainbow, thinking about foods on a spectrum, is really when we look at these longitudinal kind of epidemiological studies and looking at folks that kind of live long, but also have a high quality of life, because that's also what we're talking about, right? Like modern medicine can keep us alive for a long time. Now, what that quality of life looks like can be very different. And that's what we really try to hone in on is, maximizing quality of life, not just life expectancy, but quality of life for as long as possible. And what we find is that, when we study these different pockets of the world that have really long lifespans, but their quality of life is equally as high, they're eating whole foods, right? They're not eating heavily processed foods, right? So it's all minimally processed. They're often engaging in the agriculture or the procurement of those foods, the raising of the animals, the planting of the seeds. And then they're also engaging in other pieces, right? So this sense of community, eating together, practicing mindfulness. So, eating in a quiet space, not with lots of technology distractions and whatnot, right? So we've got a lot of these pieces that come into play for contributing to that quality of life. And this idea of culinary medicine or food as medicine, not only looks at the food piece, but also these other health and wellness pieces that affect the entire wellness of the whole person. So we're kind of looking at all of these different pieces, right? Meeting our needs nutritionally, but then also thinking about this larger picture as well.
Yeah, and it sounds like a big part of that is this understanding that we don't know everything yet. And like, although we know like there are certain supplements that can be very beneficial to us, stuff by eating a wide variety of real foods, like you're tapping into nutrients that we probably don't even know exist yet. Right. And so like I talk a lot and I'm really a big believer in eating just a variety of foods. And if you can eat a variety of foods, cook in a variety of different methods, like you're going to check a lot of these boxes, right? Like
Yep.
it can get very complex when you're looking at, well, this is how you should cook this vitamin because it's water soluble, or this is how this food should be prepared. It becomes very overwhelming, but it's like if you just try and do it in a variety of different ways, like you're going to check a lot of those boxes off, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Very much kind of this idea of eating on a kind of, I talk about this spectrum, right? So there's foods that we should eat most of the time. And then there's these other foods that we can have, some of the times, right? And kind of where that falls. Thinking about sometimes we try and it can be really complex. We can get really overwhelmed, and a lot of folks, when they start to get overwhelmed, they start to shut down. And so it's like, so very often when I work with folks about changing behaviors and starting to eat a greater variety of foods and using more fruits and vegetables and whole foods. One of the easy things that I talk about is think about how many colors are part of your meal. So whether that's on a plate or on a bowl or what have you, right? So how many colors are part of that meal? And shooting for kind of 4 or more different colors, right? So these are your fruits and vegetables, these are your whole grains, these are your oils, these are your proteins, your nuts, seeds, legumes, right? So think about that color. And that not only provides us a variety of nutrients, but it also provides us this sense of enjoyment, right? We eat with our eyes first. If something looks appealing, we are more likely to enjoy that food. And consider it delicious, versus something that, is kind of bland in color, right? I kind of imagine this plate of white pasta with an Alfredo sauce, right? Kind of bland, right? It might taste good, but you put some color in there, you change some of those kind of combinations, and all of a sudden it starts going through the roof. And I have a colleague that often would use this phrase of unapologetically delicious, and I really try to live by that. Things can be both healthful and delicious at the same time, and we don't have to compromise. And so sometimes it's thinking about the simplicity of it. Think about as many whole foods as possible and make small changes, right? We don't have to make these, 180-degree shifts overnight. And when we think about that behavior change, we're going to have lasting behavior change if we make these small incremental changes, right? So what can I do for the rest of my life? How can I eat for the rest of my life? And sometimes we think about weight loss or what have you, it can be helpful to have a kind of a jump start, a short-term kind of spurt. But then we really think about, how can I eat for the rest of my life? And very often these extreme diets do not last because they're really hard to maintain for our entire lives. And there's reasons for that. Our body is fighting against a lot of those extremes. And so have a variety of foods, right? We think about the Mediterranean style diet, that the research is very focused on kind of that specific Mediterranean diet, but the research is really starting to expand, that it's really thinking about you can morph it to your individual cultures. And it's really thinking about kind of come back to kind of the basics within that Mediterranean style diet, right? High in fruits and vegetables, whole grains, minimally processed, physical activity, mental health, all of those pieces are playing a role. And if we look at cultures around the world, they have a lot of that same kind of base to that pyramid, that really keeps us connected, and can have healthful eating patterns. We don't all have to eat like Greeks, but we can take those pieces from our kind of culture origins and build it from there.
Yeah, it's like the foundations are there across the board with the different cultures where, some cultures might be a lot more of like a pasta or rice base or more kind of bread and pastries and like that kind of thing. It's like the foundations of it being moderation and still having a variety and fresh whole foods, those types of things are things that come across the board, right? And you mentioned something as well about like how like you eat first with your eyes. I think this is something that actually becomes very discouraging for people, not in like a negative way of what you said, but I think we see things like we'll watch a cooking video and we want to follow along with it, or we try and do this recipe, and then like our food never looks the same as what the food looked like on the blog or whatever. And then you do that and you're like, oh, this is like so discouraging for me. Like I'll never be able to cook food like that. It can be like very intimidating and very discouraging. And I know I've felt that way even in my life before. I'm like, man, I followed all the steps and it looks nothing like that. And immediately it's like you have this negative association to that food. So I do want to touch on that and how people can actually start to gain a little bit more confidence with themselves in the kitchen where they can put healthy food on a plate and it can, and it doesn't have to be so complex and so overwhelming for them.
Yeah, so we're so critical of ourselves.
Right?
Right. And we think everybody is kind of this master chef. And the reality is that that we think about like just social media in general, right? Of like what filters are being used and what
Mm,
enhancement of lighting is being used. And often within food photography, it's really kind of unfortunate, but they do a lot of the kind of some of these enhancements to make
yeah.
things look brighter and not quite what you would be preparing at home. So I think some of it is shifting our brain a little bit.
Yeah.
But then also we do this in our class. So sometimes we have so typically we're cooking a variety of recipes, but sometimes depending on our class size, there might be multiple groups making the same recipe. And I think the interesting thing is that you can have, 5 different people making the same recipe, and they get to the end product and they all look similar, but they all also look different. And so I think we have to give ourselves a little bit of grace that it doesn't have to look exactly like that to A, not be appealing, and B, to not taste good, right? Like it'll still taste good. It'll still be appealing. And some of it's just kind of changing that eye that we have. And I think the more too, kind of giving some of that grace, the more that we cook, the more we prepare a variety of foods, the more we kind of learn some of those nuances of what fruit or what vegetable am I putting into the saute pan at what time, right? So what am I putting in first? Am I layering it, which is, typical of what we would see on a, from a restaurant or a chef or a professional chef kind of thing versus, you can throw it all in the pot at the same time, but it's going to cook a little bit differently. And the end product is probably going to look a little bit different as well. Thinking about, the temperature of our cooktop. So, recognizing that all stoves do not heat equally, right? So you got to kind of learn that art of it, of what does this mean for your oven or for your stovetop, right? Or
Yeah.
your pots and pans, because it does make a big difference. The types of pots and pans that you're using, I even think about like ovens. When I'm developing a recipe at home, my ovens cook very different from the ovens that we use that are in our cooking lab on campus. And so I can start that recipe development on my oven, but then
Yeah.
I have to tweak it a bit when that's a recipe I'm using for our classes so that it cooks the same or so that it ends up with that same product. Now, unfortunately, a lot of recipes are not tested to a
Yeah.
high level. And I think that can be somewhat discouraging. And so knowing where to find recipes can sometimes be challenging. And I find even that, some blogs or cookbooks are really good about testing their recipes. And those are the ones that I tend to gravitate towards versus the ones that are like this
Yeah.
blog or this
Yeah.
cookbook, like it never turns out the same, or the timing is really off.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I tend to stay away from those. And that's honestly just kind of trial and error.
Yeah.
Of finding those that work versus not, but that can be really discouraging. And so I encourage folks to try different spaces for those recipes, but then also just starting to try different recipes.
Yeah.
It's kind of like kids, right? Kids have to be exposed to new foods like hundreds of times before they could really say if they like it or not, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
building of those taste buds and changing those taste buds. And that's something too to keep in mind. Our taste buds evolve and change over our lifetime, and we can change those taste buds. So if I'm used to a highly processed diet with, lots of simple carbohydrates, kind of your simple sugars and that kind of thing, lots of added sugar, it'll take some time to adjust those taste buds, but slowly as we incorporate kind of natural sugars into our diets more, that shift will happen. It takes a couple of months, but it does happen. So stick with it.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like experience is just such a big thing. It's like just get in, start trying things and start building some experience. And the more you kind of get experience in your kitchen, like specifically in your own kitchen, the more you'll start to like understand like how this cooks a little bit crispier and nicer this way, and like all those different things and how different ingredients kind of mix and match with each other. It's lots of
Exactly.
trial
Kind
and
of
error.
those pairings, right? What tastes good with each other, not only visually, but mouth feel and
Yeah.
taste, right?
Yeah.
So I've got this potato chickpea stew, and everything's kind of soft in it, right? But then you top it with a bit of garlic aioli and toasted almonds, and so you get kind of this creaminess and
Mm.
crunch along with it,
Yeah.
and it really just balances it out and completely changes it from what it was without the toppings, right?
Yeah.
So thinking through some of those pieces, not to say it wasn't still delicious without the toppings, it's just very different. So
Yeah.
sometimes it's thinking about those other pieces that can change that flavor and taste.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just getting creative with it, right? So like creativity sounds like it's a big thing. It's like just be creative, try new things and just like get experience. What are some of the other foundational pieces that people can take away from this conversation for maybe for that person who's really not confident in the kitchen? They do want to start eating healthier. They want to stop eating out at fast food, but they're just not confident in the kitchen. So they got to start trying things.
Yeah.
You got to try and be a little bit creative. What are some of the other foundational pieces there?
Yeah, so I think it's again taking small steps and moving forward, right? So there's the good thing is that there's a lot of kind of pre-prepared or prepped vegetables in the produce section, right? So
Yeah.
you can buy pre-chopped onion or bell peppers or spiralized zucchini or what have you, right? Or even in the frozen food section. That is sometimes a good space to start when you feel like you don't have enough time to prep all of the vegetables, or that's really just very intimidating for you. That's kind of a good space to kind of that middle ground. And
Yeah.
then I encourage you to think about adding one or two more things, right? Think about things that are a little bit easier. So packing a piece of fresh fruit along with, your lunch to work or what have you. Adding some berries to your yogurt or blending up a smoothie or something of that sort. And then kind of slowly building upon those skills. So yeah, there's a lot of videos that are out there thinking about kind of learning skills, but just like bike riding, we all had to practice before we were able to stay balanced on our bike, right? It's the same thing with cooking. So allow that time for practice. And the more you practice, the easier it gets. But kind of sticking with it, right? But there are some of those helpers along the way, which are perfectly fine, right? The meal, the meal prep boxes that get delivered to your front door can be really great starters as well. All the ingredients are there, and you just have to put it together in the pot, the pan, in the oven, what have you. That can be a great way to start exploring new foods
Yep.
or new cooking methods, and not having to, buy a lot of something and you don't really enjoy it
Yep.
to begin with.
Yep. I've
So,
used those
and then
before
being
too. Yeah.
curious, right? I think we can all just be a little more curious in the kitchen, and start basic, right? A cutting
Mm.
board and a good knife, and some pots and pans, and we can do a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that advice of like just keep it simple, right? It doesn't have to be fancy. Like I've used those kind of food prep services before too, and it's great because it does kind of get you're following the instructions, so it gives you kind of a template, but it allows you to kind of build a little bit of confidence, like, oh, I didn't realize I could cook things that way, or oh, I didn't realize that, this even existed. And like there are a lot of those types of things. But then when I go back to, not using those services and I'm like, I still want to eat healthy, I just remind myself to keep it simple. It's like,
Yep.
carrots can be delicious, right? It's
Right.
just chop up some carrots and cook them up and say, steam them. And there's a lot that we can do for our health that doesn't have to be fancy, that doesn't have to be super complex. And credit to what you said earlier on in the episode, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going to be delicious as well, right?
Right. Right. Yep. Yep. And try not to be too worried about trying new things. If you don't
Yeah.
like something, that's okay, right? Like I encourage folks. It's kind of the with kids, often we think about this no bite or one bite rule,
Yeah.
where they have to try something or at least lick it or smell it or put it on their tongue or what have you, right? Same kind of thing with adults. Try different things. And right, like if you don't like steamed carrots but you like fresh carrots, eat them crunchy and raw on the side, right? Like
Yep.
it's that's fine, right? If you hate broccoli, there's plenty of other greens that will give you the same nutrients, and we can, just explore different things. But keep in mind that our taste buds do change, and sometimes it takes those repeated exposures to try something new.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I mean, this has been really, I think, beneficial for a lot of people. Just talking about how you can get into the kitchen and just kind of start cooking healthy. And just, I mean, there's so many different avenues we could explore in this conversation about how food really does help prevent disease and those types of things. But I mean, big takeaway for me from this conversation even is just that remembering that, nutrition is so vast and there's so much that we still don't know about it. But what we do know is that all of those mysteries, all of those, maybe secret formulas, they're all in the food that we have already. And so just get out there and just try things. Just keep eating things. Use a variety.
Yeah.
I appreciate you being on the show today and sharing some of what you do. And I'd be excited to connect again and hear even more and explore some more of these avenues. So, of
Excellent. Thank you for your time. And I hope your listeners did it as well. So thank you. This was great.
course, awesome. And thanks everybody for listening or watching. And we will see you in the next episode. Well, thanks to Theresa for being here on the show today. So cool to hear that mix between the science of nutrition and the art of nutrition, and how we can take cooking and nutrition and culinary medicine and make it practical and effective for everyday living. If you enjoyed this episode, please engage with the show, like, share, comment. If you're listening, take a screenshot of where you're at in the show. Tag us on social media. We'd love to hear from you. You can find us on Instagram at Wellness Dojo YYC or at Wellness Dojo Podcast, or by searching the Wellness Dojo on all other platforms. Look forward to having you in the next episode.